All right, so very simple scene, plane and sphere. I put an IBL in it. I put a directional light for the sun, and that's only so we can see what's going on. All right, let me zoom in on the sphere. And one thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I've got a separate material assigned to the sphere, because I don't necessarily want the same bump map on the plane that I want on the sphere. That's just kind of common sense, right? You want to have different materials for different parts of your surface. That way you can control reflectivity, you can control texture, you can control bump. Right. Now, first off, let's take a little review. What do bump maps contain? Black and white information. With that black and white information, what do we use white for?
Pull out detail.
You're close, very close. We're not quite pulling out detail. Well, it is an illusion. Remember, it's all illusion of what we call surface relief. So that white is actually looking like it's embossed or being raised up off the surface. Black does the opposite. Black looks like it recedes. If you don't want any change at all on a bump map, that's 50% gray. So most of the time, what you will do in a bump map is make it start off with a 50% gray bump map. And then when you add white or you add black, you'll get raised up and you'll get lowered areas. And different levels of gray between white and 50% or between black and 50% will do various things to it. All right, so there are a couple of things that happen when you use bump maps. First off, you have a choice of either overall bump or standard bump. What's the difference between the two? Anybody know? Okay, it was in the video. Overall bump will apply the bump to both the specular component and the diffuse component of your material. So you see it in both the reflective parts and in the non-reflective parts, the diffuse. Okay, that's its job. That's all it does. Overall bump. Standard bump behaves exactly the same way in the beginning, except with standard bump, you've got a little switch at the bottom, and that switch is called no diffuse bump, which means you will only see bump in the spec part of your material, like you would if it were a coating. For example, you guys have all seen examples of ceramic fired vases, or pottery, or statues, or something. Right? When you do ceramics, you usually have a glaze on top of it, which creates a glass-like polished finish. Now, a lot of times, that's powder, or it's sprayed on in some manner, and then fired, and then it melts together to create that coating. And what happens is, occasionally, that coating, while your vase, your object might be really smooth, sometimes that coating gets a little bit bumpy. It's not perfectly flat, but you don't notice it until you put it under light and move it around until you start to see that little bit of wave. That's because the coating is got a little bit of relief to it, but not the actual object. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off using a bump in my sphere. I'm going to use overall bump. I'm going to use 2D, and I'm going to use one of what we call the procedurals in Mile. Procedurals are basically synthetic textures. They are computer-generated bits of code that create either fractal-based patterns or noise-based patterns. And we control those noise-based or fractal-based patterns to give us different results. So I'm going to choose what's called a noise. Now I'm not going to see any bump in my viewport because the viewport does not handle bumps. Bump is only when it's rendered do you see that surface relief. And that's the difference between a bump map and a normal map. Normal maps you see in real time for game engines. Bump maps are for rendered images, for the most part. Okay, so if I render this again with that noise in there, you'll see I get this illusion that it's this gnarly, kind of craggy looking piece of stone. All right, and that is all illusion. And how do I know it's illusion? Well, let me render it again. I'm going to hide the plane. Render it. And what I'm going to do is turn on my alpha channel. Now remember, in the viewport you can view either RGB or alpha. And if I choose alpha, alpha basically shows me what is transparent when you put it into a compositing package or what is opaque or kept. Now, is there any profile change in this? Right? You look at the bump and you think, okay, well, I'm going to have bits and pieces missing here on the sides. But when you look at the alpha, are they missing? No. So this tells you this is a bump map, it's an illusion. There is no displacement at all. And that's the difference between a bump map and a displacement. Displacement physically changes geometry at render time. A bump map is all illusion. And the bump map is based on angle of the normal to the angle of the camera. Remember, our surface normals tell us what's going on. So, when the normal is facing right at the camera, you see the most bump. When the normal is 90 degrees to the camera, the bump is basically gone. Because as the normal changes in relationship to the camera, the bump effect gets less and less until 90 degrees, there's nothing changing. That's why it's all illusion. Smoke and mirrors. Right, is that clear so far? Okay. All right, so by default, when you create a bump, you drop a file in. And if your file is not black and white, Maya will use what's called the luminance or the value information from the file. It does not actually use color information. If you go into the hypershade and I look at my network, here's my file. Notice that nothing from the output of my color in that file is being used. My bump, and this is my bump utility that's created automatically for me whenever you plug something into the bump channel. Does that make sense? You get that for free. Right? You can see that it's taking just alpha information or luminance value information, and that's what it's using to determine what gets raised up and what gets lowered. Now, how big or small that bump is going to be determined by my place 2D. Remember, the more I have a copy across the surface, the smaller it's going to look. The amount of bump, how dominant it is, that's controlled by the bump utility in an attribute called bump depth. Now, by default, bump depth is set at 1. All right, let me keep image. And notice that my slider for the bump depth is right in the middle. That's because you can either raise or lower it positive or lower it in the negative numbers. Now, if you flip that bump depth to -1, what it will do is invert all the colors. So it'll take white, flip it to black, black, flip it to white, and that's basically it. So notice now it kind of looks like the Earth with mountainous areas, and you got this area that's, looks like water. And it's directly inverted from the other. Right? So what that means is if you've created a bump map, you throw it into your scene and it's giving you the reverse of what you want, just lower the bump to the negative value. Right? It's just the opposite. If you really want to, you can go into Photoshop and flip it or invert it, but you don't really need to. You can just go into negative numbers. Now, one thing that tricks up students a lot is when they're working with bumps, a lot of times they may go, well, I'm going to lower it a little, and they accidentally go into the negative numbers, which means you flipped your bump. So, my recommendation is, just like anything else with Maya, if you don't know where to start, take the number that's there and cut it in half. If it's too much, cut it in half. If it's not enough, double it. You've got a starting point. So what I always wind up doing is I will say, okay, cut your bump in half, render it out, and see what it looks like. Okay, not nearly as intense. Okay, what you can do again, if it's still too much, knock it down, cut it in half. Keep cutting it in half until it matches your reference, or until it gives you a result artistically that you like. Most of the time with bumps, less is more. You don't want to put it on so intense that it smacks people in the face and says, this is a bump map. That doesn't work. You want it to be there so they don't notice it, but if it wasn't there, they would notice it. That's the whole idea. All right, now, I'm going to go back and increase this back to where it was at 1, just because it gives a nice stark challenge. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that bump and I'm going to take it out of overall and plug it into standard so that you can see what the difference is between the two. Now, a lot of ways I can do that. I happen to like to do it in the hypershade because once I graph my network, all I have to do is go down here and switch this little noodle down to standard bump. I can click on the other one, delete it. So now you can see my noise is now plugged into standard. So I'm going to keep image and re-render it. By default, you should not see any difference at all. Right? Looks exactly the same when I render it. The difference will be if I turn on this no diffuse bump and I render it out. Now what will happen is my bump will not be visible in the diffuse part of the material, but only in the reflective spec part. You see that? Only where I see reflectivity or specular highlights do I now see the bump. So this acts more like a coating than it does being applied to the actual surface. Now, as far as creating a bump, when you create a bump, you have to figure out, all right, what is my texture? Do I want to pull a bump from that, or am I going to use something else? So in the case of something like floor tile, you may wind up using several different things. One might be a grid pattern, so you get the tile and the grout area looking right like you want it. And then in there, you might use another bump to get kind of the wavy pattern that you might see on top of the tile. Especially if it's non-skid tile, it'll be kind of roughed up, and it won't be perfectly flat and smooth. All right, so far, any questions on bump, overall bump versus standard bump, how to control a bump, whether it's lowering the amount of bump or going into negative? Because that's really the key to controlling a bump once you've got it made. Now the question is, to make a bump, we have to go in and decide what we need. All right, so to do that, I'm going to go back here. All right, so I've got some vinyl tile here that I want to use for the floor. This is one of those 12 by 12 vinyl tiles you see all the time if you go into Lowe's or Home Depot or any flooring store or any, big box store that sells this stuff. All right, 12 by 12 tile. A lot of times you can go to the manufacturer's website. They've got pictures of these. These work fairly well if they are cropped properly to make repeatable, because this is one self-contained unit, right? You just keep repeating it until you get the size of the floor tiles you want. Now, when we examine this, we want to take a look at what do we have here, right? We've got vinyl, not very thick. So the amount of bump on here is not going to be great like it is in the brick wall. But we do want to have low-lying areas where they've got this illusion that there's some grout there and you've got little bits of stone that make up this whole tile. So we have to figure out what do we need out of this file in order to be a successful bump map. First off, these grout areas here, what color do they need to be if we want to get the right bump effect? Well, first off, we have to figure out, do we want them raised up off the surface or do we want them lowered? Be black, yeah. Or dark, very dark. All right. The tiles themselves, we want them to kind of raise up, so they're going to be higher value than 50% gray, right? They're going to be light. Maybe not white because that would raise up way too much, but they're going to be some kind of light gray. And then in here, we're probably going to have some dark and light areas that are going to make up for little indentations and little areas that are raised up on top of that. So what I can do is open this up in Photoshop. So first thing I get, diffuse, right? It's going to be my diffuse. Where's the diffuse get plugged into? Yeah, the diffuse color. So that's going to be my diffuse map. So first thing I'm going to do is save as. So this is going to be my 1702 vinyl tile. This is going to be a Targa. diffuse. Always name your files. All right, we don't need an alpha channel, so it's going to be 24-bit. From here, anytime you go to work on this with layers, save it out as a PSD file. Why?
So that you can go back in it.
You can go back in and edit it with layers. Also, Photoshop will not compress it any further. The last thing you want to do is save out a JPEG as a JPEG, because you're compressing a compressed file. And every time you compress a compressed file, each version gets worse and worse and worse. So you always want to try to keep it in a version where it's not going to get any worse, so that when you save it out, you get the file integrity and quality that you want. All right, so I'm going to do a save as. Going to save out my format as a PSD. Good. All right, so if we're going to make a bump map from this, do we need color information? No. So, what can we do to get rid of the color? Yeah.
Put a black and white mask on it?
Put a black and white mask, or that would absolutely work. We can use an adjustment layer. Adjustment layers, remember, will create a brand new layer. Anything under it will maintain whatever that layer is. So if you put a black and white adjustment layer, everything that sits under that adjustment layer becomes black and white. Adjustment layers are down here at the bottom. It's a half dark, half light circle, and it's right in the middle, black and white. Nice thing is you can turn it off and on. And it creates a mask for you automatically, which is nice. All right, so part one done. Could we use this as is for our bump map?
No,
Why?
it's not black and white.
Well, it is now.
Oh, wait, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's all gray too.
Well, it's all gray. That's one issue, absolutely. What's the other one?
The parts that we want to be lowered are white.
Yeah, these are, basically they're reversed from what we want. So let's take care of the reverse part first, and then we'll get into trying to get some more contrast between it. All right, don't forget there's another adjustment layer for that called invert. So go down, it's like the bottom quarter. So now we invert it or reverse it. Now this is a little bit closer to what we want to use. This is dark, this is lighter. So far, so good. Now, this is all part of that non-destructive workflow I talked about in Lecture 9. This way, if I don't like anything, I can just turn it off. I've got my original pixels back. Nothing's been damaged. That's why I'm a big proponent of working on layers. Making the layers do the work for you rather than altering the actual pixels. All right, so we've solved two problems so far. We got one more to go, right? We determined we don't need color information. We determined that color, once we got black and white, needed to be reversed. That part's done. Now, good news is, and I don't want to confuse you, but if you forget to invert it, you can always go into Maya and take your bump in the negative direction, right? That will give you the same result. But since you're making this file, you may as well do it right from the beginning. All right, so what we can do to get more contrast between the two, between the grout here and the tile parts, is we can apply either exposure, adjustment layer, curves, levels, contrast, and brightness. They will basically all get you the same result if you tweak them enough. My personal preference is I like to use levels. Because I get that little histogram. And I get 3 channels to play with. I get highlights, I get midtones, and I get shadowed information. Now the fact that I see mostly midtones here, you see that big spike in the center, that's because I've made this grayscale and I've inverted it. And this information, there's a lot of what we call midtone gray information in here. Midtones are where most images contain the most information. So what I like to do is, in my curves, I like to get rid of all the highs that are not visible to the eye. I'm basically compressing it. So notice, just by moving my highlights to where the curve starts to go up, taking my shadows to where that starts to curve up, I get a lot more contrast. Now, I can make that contrast darker. If I move my midtones towards the whites, I'm increasing the bandwidth of my shadow. Or I can make it more compressed, as in this case. Right, so this should give me a little bit more room in my bump map for it to look a little bit better, right? Not quite as much gray information. I've made more contrast. Okay, I've got some areas that are dark. Those are going to be indented. I've got my grout, which is darker than the tile itself. I've got some white areas here, so they will raise up slightly above the standard part of the tile. So that's going to give me that uneven look that I want out of that vinyl tile. Remember, if you were to feel this vinyl tile, you'd be able to feel all those nooks and crannies, all the bumps, all the imperfections in it. So far, is this helping? Okay, good. All right, so this I would call my bump map. I'm going to save my PSD. I'm going to go do a file save as. And this is going to be a Targa file. And I'm going to call it bump. So now, what I want to look at is, what kind of material property would vinyl have? Is it going to be diffuse? Is it going to be highly glossy reflective? What's it going to be? What's that?
Like a little reflective?
Yeah, it'll probably be a little reflective.
It's more glossy than it is reflective.
Yeah, it's going to be more glossy, so we're not going to be able to see like really crisp environmental reflections. We're going to see a sheen on it. And what we want to control is, with a spec map, how do we help this file look more like vinyl? We do it with a spec map because any of the low-lying areas are not going to pick up as much light as areas that are raised up, right? When you shine a light on something, all the things that stick up get all the light. All the things that are low get the shadow. So what we want to do is we want to have a spec map that will help us define which parts are reflective when we apply this to our material. So the white areas, these little light areas here, and I'm looking at it just at the bump map right now. These are going to be the most reflective. The black areas, they are going to be almost non-reflective completely. Anything else that's 50% gray will sort of be half reflective. Does that make sense? So what we're looking to do is sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes we can use a spec map and get it from our bump. because they contain sort of similar information. Although the trouble with that is most bump maps are way too contrasty. Whereas a spec surface, reflective surface, is going to be more subtle. So this works pretty good, but what I may want to do is use that for my spec map, because it'll knock down the total reflectivity automatically, and it'll give me some darker areas where it's not going to be reflective, lighter areas are going to be more reflective. Or I can go somewhere in between. A lot of times in Photoshop, what I might wind up doing is make another set of levels. So a lot of times I will rename whatever levels I've got on there. I use this one for the bump. I may create another one for the spec. One thing I want to avoid doing is using them both at the same time. So for this one, maybe I bring it up a little bit. I don't necessarily want to have complete non-reflectivity here. So just a little bit of difference between the two. I've got a little more dark areas here, so I've got more 50% gray in there than I did for my bump. If I don't like it, I can come back in and tweak it so it gives me what I want. And this is all going to be based on reference anyway. All right, so what I'm going to do is try this out as my spec map. Okay. So far, so good. Got a diffuse map, a bump map, spec map. Going to quit out of Photoshop because Maya and Photoshop do not work well together. They hate each other. All right, any questions on just applying a bump before I close this scene out? All right, let me set my project, and I will apply what we just did to the floor in the interior scene. This same procedure could be done on the exterior too, for the table. Could be done for the cutting board, could be done for the bread, could be done for the wall, could be done for almost anything. Wrong one. Okay. All right, so this one has no glass bottles in it, so it shouldn't take as long to render. But you get the idea. So I've got my placeholder material on the floor. I've sort of got it set up where I think I need the spec on there. Not really sure. Now, whenever I work on something like this, and I'm going to be applying multiple files, a lot of times what I'll do is I will, believe it or not, apply the bump first. Because I will put the bump on, adjust the amount of bump, adjust the repeat of it, get it to look good, and then I can apply my diffuse, which is the color. That way I'm not distracted by the color and I can see how much bump is there. I can gauge the scale a little bit better without being, distracted by shiny, colorful objects. All right, now when we go to apply a file, don't forget, it gets plugged into whatever you're going to be working in. So for me, for the bump, I'm going to go down and select overall bump, because I want this to be applied to both the spec and the diffuse part of the material. So bump, 2D texture, file. All right, in file 1, I'm going to plug in the bump I just made, which is my 1702 vinyl tile bump. And what I'm going to do is, let's render from the render cam, see what that looks like. And instead of rendering the entire thing, I'm going to render just the floor. Whoa. After I cut down my quality. All right, so I'm going to go into the camera, right click, do a snapshot of my camera, and I'm going to render this little region out right here. So all I did was apply my file with the default settings on the floor. And you can see too much bump, and that is one tile covering that floor. Now, how big should that tile be? Does anybody remember? Most vinyl tiles like that are 12 by 12. So unless this is a dollhouse, that's way too big. So the first thing I'm going to do, even before I play around with the amount of bump, is I'm going to make it repeat or copy itself. So how do I make it copy or repeat itself across the surface?
You gotta have your shade and go to that place to textures.
Everybody hear that? Hypershade, graph my network, find my file. The place 2D that's attached to the file, that's where the magic will happen. And ideally, what I should have done was rename my file which actually I think I did when I did the initial. Yep, I did. Good. So it's floor. All right. So here, place 2D texture. I can make it repeat twice. So when it repeats 2 times, you're actually getting 4 copies, right? It's 2 in U, 2 in V. While that looks better, that is still about 5 or 6 feet wide. So I needed to repeat more. So I'm going to double it. Let's go back, re-render that. Better. Probably still too big. Let me double that again. Still pretty big. Remember, this is one tile, not all these individual little ones. So that's still pretty big. That's still probably about a 3-foot tile. So let me double it one more time, see what I get. No, I didn't. That'll be nasty. All right, let's try that. All right, so this is one tile here. Still looks kind of big. Don't know if I need to double this. Let me try just going up to 20. All right, that's probably closer to what I want. I'll use that for now, because what I want to do is adjust the amount of bump. So right now, way too much bump depth. Bump depth by default set at 1. All I have to do is find my bump utility here, click on it, and start adjusting the bump depth. So when you're not sure, start by cutting it in half, as I mentioned, until you get the desired amount. You'll notice as you start to lower it, it's going to look more and more realistic, more and more believable. Still way too much bump. Still too much bump. Looks better, but not nearly low enough. Okay, starting to look a little better. Cut it down again. And that's probably close to being appropriate. Maybe come a little higher with that. It's roughly appropriate for what I want. All right, so that gives me a little bit of surface relief. Remember, I don't want to go crazy because this is a vinyl floor. Vinyl floor is not going to have a lot of relief in it. Right, so at this point, I think I'm pretty happy with my results for the bump. Does that help? Okay, now, what I want to do here is, before I wrap this up, I want to apply the diffuse. Now, the diffuse and the bump, should they match up or should they be separate? They should match up, exactly. So I'm going to show you a trick on how to match it up where you take the same Place 2D texture and it drives both the diffuse and the bump. So if you change one thing, it changes all of them for you. Now, when I want to plug in my color, it goes where? Diffuse color. So MIA Material X, diffuse color, going to go 2D, file, and I'm going to bring in my diffuse. So now when I render it out, do they match? No, they do not. You can see this is the grout right here, and right now that's taking up the entire floor. So what I want is my diffuse to repeat or copy itself exactly the same as the bump. To do that, I go into the hypershade. What I'm going to do to clean up my hypershade is select my floor material and graph the input-output using these two buttons, or it's a double-sided button. Now, the Place 2D, that is my master, is the one from the bump. So I want to use that Place 2D to also drive my diffuse texture. All right, so here's my bump network. This Place 2D, I want to drive my diffuse color right here. So what I'm going to do is hold down the Command key. I'm going to click on my original Place 2D right at the little hamburger icon, that little stacking icon. I'm going to hold down Command, middle mouse, drag it down to the picture over here of my vinyl tile. There we go. And it will replace it automatically. Right, let me do that again for you guys. All right, so by default, I've got two separate place 2Ds. I want one place 2D to rule them all, right? This is Lord of Placement. So my original one that I spent all the time working on is this one right here, the one that gets plugged into the bump. So I want to take my bump place 2D, hold down Command, middle mouse drag from the hamburger stacking icon here to the picture that's on my file node. And that will automatically break the connection. This is free floating. What can I do with this? Do I want to keep it? Put it on the refrigerator? Delete it. Yeah, this is one time in Maya where it's really gratifying that you can destroy something and feel really good about it without Maya destroying you. So all I have to do is select it, delete it. Now when I render out, keep image, my diffuse and my bump will line up perfectly. Big difference. All right, so that looks more like a vinyl floor. So that little trick of having one place 2D drive all the other parts of your files is really essential to making an efficient network. This way you don't have to go back in and go, okay, I had it repeat 20 times in U and V for the bump. I have to go into the diffuse and make it repeat 20 times. No, you just use one place 2D. Now, to top this off, I can go in and I can take my spec map and plug that into where else? Where do spec maps get plugged into? Reflection color. So then I can control the parts that are reflective and non-reflective. So go back to my material. I'm going to go to reflection color. I'm going to plug in my spec map. Now what I want to do is I want my place 2D that's driving the bump and the diffuse to also drive my spec. Right? I want it to repeat so it's exactly right. I do the same thing. Hold down Command. From my original place 2D, the stacking icon, middle mouse drag, drop it on top of my file 3 image. Takes a second sometimes. And now, all the reflectivity in there should match up with the file I just made. It's going to be subtle. You can see a little bit of difference over here. It's not quite as even as it was. Now, if I want to see more reflectivity, I can go in and I can adjust my material. So for example, I've got lowered reflectivity, so maybe I turn it up to see what it's doing. All right, so you can see reflectivity here. But you can see areas where it's not reflective. Any of the low-lying areas are non-reflective. So now that I've got a spec map, I can kind of tweak my reflectivity. The glossiness will probably more or less be the same. So I just turn down the amount of reflectivity so it should give me something more like what I want. All right, so that is utilizing a diffuse, and out of the diffuse We made the bump, we made the spec, and we applied it to a surface. We made all the files be controlled by one place 2D.